Ibrahim Traoré stared at the screen in disbelief as he read the news about himself. Under the headline, Africa's Dictator, he was attributed words he had never spoken. His response to this smear campaign would change the world media order. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Ouagadougou. Traoré had developed a habit of reviewing international news coverage about Burkina Faso during his breakfast, not out of vanity, but as a strategic necessity. As the leader of a nation challenging Western economic interests, he needed to understand how his country was being portrayed to the world. The article on the screen was from one of the most respected news outlets in Europe, a publication with a 2-century legacy and self-proclaimed commitment to journalistic integrity. The headline was jarring enough. Africa's New Dictator, How Ibrahim Traoré is Crushing Dissent While Blaming the West. But it was the supposed quotes that made Traoré set down his coffee cup. The article claimed he had said, "Democracy is a Western concept unsuited to African realities. What our people need is a strong hand, not endless debate. And later, we will silence those who spread Western propaganda in our country, by any means necessary." "I never said any of this," Traoré said quietly to his aide, Ouedraogo, who was reviewing the morning's security briefings at the other end of the table. Ouedraogo looked up. "Which publication?" "The European Chronicle." Ouedraogo sighed. "That's the third major Western outlet this week. The Guardian piece called you erratic and dangerous. The Washington Post editorial suggested sanctions." Traoré scrolled through the article, noting how it wove these fabricated quotes into a narrative that portrayed his resource nationalization policies as driven by personal ambition rather than national interest. The journalist had never requested an interview or sought comment from his government. "Get me Communications Minister Ouedraogo," Traoré said, "and find out if this journalist ever entered Burkina Faso or requested comment from our press office." As Ouedraogo made the calls, Traoré continued reading. The pattern was becoming clear. Since his government had canceled unfavorable mining contracts with Western corporations 3 months ago, international media coverage had shifted dramatically. Before, he had been portrayed as a young, promising reformer. Now, without any change in his governance style or policies, he was being labeled a dictator, a threat, a destabilizing force. Communications Minister Fatima Ouedraogo arrived within the hour, tablet in hand, already aware of the latest article. "We've issued the usual rebuttal," she said, demanding a correction and right of reply, but based on past experience. "They'll ignore it," Traoré finished, "or publish our statement on page 20, below the advertisements for luxury watches." Ouedraogo nodded grimly. "We've also checked on the journalist. Claude Dupont has never been to Burkina Faso. No interview requests were filed. The quotes appear to be completely fabricated." Traoré rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out over Ouagadougou's morning bustle. The disconnect between the peaceful, developing city before him and the image of chaos and repression portrayed in Western media couldn't be more stark. "It's not just about me," he said finally. "This is happening to any African leader who challenges the economic status quo. President Diallo in Mali faced the same treatment when he questioned French military presence. President Ouattara in Ivory Coast was a respected statesman until he renegotiated cocoa export terms, then suddenly became increasingly autocratic. It's a coordinated campaign," agreed Ouedraogo. "The question is how to counter it effectively. Traditional diplomatic channels aren't working." Traoré turned from the window, his expression resolute. "Then we need new channels. If they control the medium, we'll create our own." The next morning, Traoré called a meeting unlike any his administration had convened before. Instead of ministers and military officials, the presidential conference room was filled with young tech entrepreneurs, software developers, and social media experts, all Burkinabe, most under 30 years old. "I've invited you here," Traoré began, "because you represent Burkina Faso's digital future. You understand the power of technology and social networks in ways many of my generation do not." He explained the situation frankly. The coordinated media campaign against his government, the fabricated quotes, the shift in narrative that coincided precisely with his resource sovereignty policies. "Western media outlets are inaccessible to us," he continued. "Our responses are ignored, our perspectives excluded. So I'm asking you, how can we communicate directly with the world, bypassing these gatekeepers?" The room was silent for a moment. Then a young woman in her mid-20s, Amina Konate, spoke up. She was the founder of Burkitech, a small but innovative software development company. "Mr. President, the answer is already in our hands," she said, holding up her smartphone. "Social media platforms allow direct communication with global audiences. No editors, no corporate filters. We've been using Twitter and Facebook," noted Sawadogo. "But our reach is limited, and we're still operating on platforms controlled by Western tech companies." Another participant, Ousmane Diallo, a cybersecurity specialist who had studied in Seoul before returning to Burkina Faso, raised a crucial point. "These platforms use algorithms that often suppress content that challenges Western narratives," he explained. "They call it combating misinformation. But the effect is that certain perspectives, particularly African ones, are systematically downranked." "So, what's the solution?" Traoré asked. Konate and Diallo exchanged glances. "We build our own platform," they said almost simultaneously. The discussion that followed was technical, creative, and increasingly excited. The concept that emerged was ambitious, an Africa-centered social media platform designed specifically to amplify voices typically marginalized in global discourse. It would feature built-in translation across major African languages, verification processes to combat actual misinformation, and a design that prioritized substantive content over sensationalism. "We could call it Vérité, truth," suggested Konate. "A platform where African perspectives aren't filtered through Western lenses." Traoré listened, asked questions, and finally made a decision. "How quickly could you build a prototype?" Konate considered. "With the right team and resources, 30 days for a basic working version." "You have 30 days, Traoré said. "The government will provide funding and resources, but no editorial control. This must be independent to be credible, not a state propaganda tool, but a genuine platform for unfiltered communication." As the young tech experts left, energized by the challenge, Sawadogo expressed concern. "Sir, this is unprecedented. A head of state initiating a social media platform?" "We're not initiating it," Traoré corrected. "We're enabling it. These young people have the vision and skills. They just needed the opportunity." Over the next 30 days, a remarkable collaboration unfolded. Konate assembled a team of 25 developers working from a converted warehouse in Ouagadougou's technology district. The government provided funding and equipment, but true to Traoré's word, maintained no editorial oversight. The team worked around the clock, fueled by a sense of purpose that transcended mere professional ambition. Many had experienced firsthand the frustration of seeing their country misrepresented in global media, their perspectives dismissed or ignored. Now they had the chance to build something that could change that dynamic. The technical challenges were substantial. Building a platform that could handle multiple African languages, many of which had limited digital support, required innovative solutions. Creating verification systems that were rigorous without being exclusionary demanded careful balance. And designing an algorithm that prioritized substantive content without imposing political bias was a complex ethical and technical puzzle. Traoré visited the project only once, midway through development. As he toured the facility, watching young Burkinabe programmers building something that could potentially reshape global information flows, he felt a surge of pride. "This is real independence," he told Konate. "Not just political or economic, but informational, the ability to tell our own stories." He observed the team working on the translation engine, which would allow users to post in Moure, Dioula, or any of Burkina Faso's local languages and have their content automatically translated into major global languages. Another group was developing verification systems that would authenticate users without requiring the Western-centric identification that excluded many Africans from digital platforms. "What about funding long-term?" Traoré asked. "No platform can survive on government support alone." "We're building a business model based on partnerships with African businesses," Konate explained. "Not intrusive advertising, but integrated support from companies that share our values. And a premium verification tier for organizations and public figures." On day 30, Vérité was launched with little fanfare, just a simple announcement on existing social media channels and a press release distributed to African news outlets. The platform was elegant in its simplicity. Users could post content in any language, with automatic translation into major African languages as well as English, French, Chinese, and Arabic. Verification was rigorous but transparent. Most importantly, the algorithm was designed to prioritize substantive content rather than merely inflammatory or sensational material. Traoré created an account but didn't immediately post. He wanted the platform to establish itself organically before he used it as a communication channel. For the first week, adoption was modest, primarily Burkinabe citizens and some users from neighboring countries. But then, something unexpected happened. A prominent Nigerian author shared a lengthy analysis of Western economic policy in Africa that had been rejected by several international publications. On Verité, it quickly gained traction, with translations making it accessible across linguistic barriers. The essay was thoughtful, substantive, and critical of Western economic orthodoxy, precisely the kind of perspective that often struggled to find an audience in global media. On Verité, it reached hundreds of thousands of readers across Africa and beyond. By the end of the second week, user numbers had exceeded 1 million. Journalists, academics, and thought leaders from across Africa and the global South were joining, attracted by the platform's commitment to unfiltered perspectives. Then came the watershed moment. A massive protest in Paris against France's neo-colonial policies in Africa received minimal coverage in mainstream French media. Protesters used Verité to share real-time videos and first-hand accounts, reaching millions across Africa and beyond. The contrast between this direct reporting and the sanitized mainstream coverage was stark, driving another wave of user adoption. The platform was evolving in ways even its creators hadn't anticipated. Users were developing innovative applications of its features: collaborative translation projects, cross-border community organizing, decentralized journalism initiatives. It was becoming not just a communication tool, but a space for Pan-African collaboration that transcended national and linguistic boundaries. 3 weeks after launch, with Verité's user base approaching 5 million, Traoré finally made his first post. It was not a fiery denunciation of Western media, as many might have expected, but something more powerful: the complete transcript of a speech he had given the previous day on resource sovereignty, alongside video footage of the entire address. "Judge my words and actions for yourself," he wrote. "No filters, no selective editing, no imposed narrative." The post spread rapidly, not just on Verité, but across other social media platforms as users shared screenshots and links. Many commented on the disconnect between Traoré's actual rhetoric, measured, substantive, focused on economic development, and the dictator caricature presented in Western media. A week later, Traoré used the platform to address the fabricated quotes directly. He posted side-by-side comparisons of what he had actually said in various speeches versus how his words had been misrepresented. He didn't attack the journalists or publications by name, instead letting the evidence speak for itself. The response was immediate and far-reaching. Users began conducting similar analyses of Western media coverage of other African leaders, identifying patterns of misrepresentation that correlated with challenges to Western economic interests. Hashtags like #MediaColonialism and #TellOurOwnStory began trending globally. What began as one leader's response to personal misrepresentation was evolving into a broader movement for media accountability and narrative sovereignty. Mainstream media outlets initially ignored Verité, then dismissed it as a state-sponsored propaganda platform. But as its user base continued to grow and its impact on global discourse became undeniable, they were forced to engage. The European Chronicle, which had published the fabricated quotes that sparked Traoré's initiative, finally issued a clarification, stopping short of a full retraction, but acknowledging that the quotes could not be verified. Other publications began reaching out to Traoré's government for comment before publishing stories, a basic journalistic practice they had previously neglected. 6 weeks after Verité's launch, with the platform now boasting over 10 million users across Africa and beyond, Traoré received an unexpected request. The BBC wanted to interview him about the social media phenomenon he had helped create. After careful consideration, he agreed, but with one condition. The interview will be conducted live, and the full unedited version will be simultaneously streamed on Verité, he stipulated. The BBC reluctantly agreed, and the resulting interview became a defining moment in modern media history. The veteran British journalist arrived prepared to focus on allegations that Verité was a tool of state control, but Traoré calmly redirected the conversation. "Let's discuss why Verité needed to exist in the first place," he said. "Why millions of Africans felt their perspectives were excluded from global discourse. Why professional journalists attribute quotes to me that I never said without seeking verification." The interviewer, momentarily flustered, acknowledged that the industry sometimes fell short of its ideals. "It's not about individual failures," Traoré responded. "It's about systemic bias. When African leaders implement policies that benefit their people but challenge Western economic interests, media narratives shift predictably. We're portrayed as dictators, as irrational, as dangerous, not because our governance has changed, but because we've touched the true third rail, resources that Western economies have long taken for granted. As the interview progressed, Traoré was neither defensive nor confrontational. He simply presented his case with clarity and evidence, embodying the very opposite of the erratic dictator persona that had been constructed around him. What made the interview truly revolutionary, however, was what was happening simultaneously on Vérité. Viewers watching the live stream were providing real-time commentary and fact-checking, verifying Traoré's statements, contextualizing the interviewer's questions, identifying misleading framing. This created an unprecedented dynamic where the interviewer's questions and framing were being analyzed even as the conversation unfolded. At one point, when the journalist referred to widespread concerns about human rights in Burkina Faso, the Vérité feed instantly filled with context, users posting reports from independent human rights organizations that contradicted this characterization. Others noting that such concerns had only emerged after Traoré's resource nationalization policies. The BBC interviewer, initially unaware of this parallel conversation, gradually realized something unusual was happening when Traoré referenced points being made in the Vérité feed. By the interview's end, the power dynamic had shifted noticeably, the journalist no longer controlling the narrative, but participating in a multi-directional conversation. When the interview concluded, the BBC journalist, to his credit, acknowledged the unusual power balance. "I've never conducted an interview where my own performance was being evaluated in real time by thousands of viewers," he admitted off-air. "That's the future of accountability," Traoré replied. "Not just for political leaders, but for those who shape public narratives." The interview was viewed by millions, both on the BBC and on Vérité. More importantly, it demonstrated a new model of media engagement, one where African leaders weren't simply responding to Western framings, but participating in a genuinely global conversation on more equal terms. In the months that followed, Vérité continued its remarkable growth, evolving from a governmental initiative into a truly independent platform. Konaté and her team secured private investment that allowed them to maintain operations without reliance on state funding. Though Traoré's administration remained a supporter, the platform's impact extended far beyond Burkina Faso. Other African leaders began using it to communicate directly with global audiences, bypassing the filters of Western media. Citizen journalists documented stories that mainstream outlets ignored. Academics shared research that challenged conventional economic narratives. Perhaps most significantly, Vérité created space for a genuine pan-African discourse that had previously been fragmented by language barriers and national boundaries. Ideas and movements could now spread across the continent with unprecedented speed and reach. The platform became a virtual agora where citizens from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Cairo to Cape Town could engage directly with each other's perspectives and experiences. 1 year after reading those fabricated quotes about himself, Traoré addressed a tech conference in Kigali, Rwanda, where Vérité, now with over 50 million users, was being celebrated as one of Africa's most successful digital innovations. What began as a response to misrepresentation has become something much more powerful, he told the audience. Not just a platform for communication, but a space for connection and collaboration across borders. Not just a tool for leaders to speak to citizens, but for citizens to speak to each other and to the world. He acknowledged Konaté and her team, who had grown Burkitech into one of Africa's leading technology companies on the strength of Verité's success. The platform had created thousands of tech jobs across the continent and was inspiring a new generation of African digital innovators. The colonial era was defined by control of physical resources, Traoré continued. The neo-colonial era has been defined by control of economic systems. But the future will be defined by control of information. Who can speak? Who is heard? Whose perspectives shape global understanding? He paused, looking out at the audience of young African tech innovators. For too long, Africa's story has been told by others. We were defined by how we fit into external narratives, as problems to be solved, markets to be exploited, or cautionary tales. Vérité has demonstrated that when we have the tools to tell our own stories, a very different picture emerges. The success of Vérité had not come without challenges. Western governments had raised concerns about unregulated content, though the platform's verification standards were actually more rigorous than most established social networks. Some authoritarian leaders in Africa had attempted to use it for genuine propaganda purposes, leading to difficult decisions about content moderation. But these challenges were being addressed through transparent processes and community governance structures that reflected the platform's core mission, amplifying authentic voices rather than imposing any single narrative. A council composed of journalists, academics, and civil society representatives from across Africa had been established to oversee content policies, ensuring that Verité remained true to its founding principles. As the conference concluded, a journalist from the European Chronicle, the same publication that had printed those fabricated quotes, approached Traoré for comment. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. President Traoré, your critics suggest that Verité has contributed to media fragmentation and undermined traditional journalistic institutions. How do you respond? Traoré considered the question thoughtfully. I believe Verité has done exactly the opposite. It hasn't fragmented media. It has expanded it, making space for voices that were previously excluded. It hasn't undermined journalism. It has challenged it to be more accurate, more inclusive, more accountable. He continued. The best journalists have nothing to fear from direct communication platforms. In fact, many now use Verité to discover stories and perspectives they wouldn't otherwise encounter. The only journalism that's threatened is the kind that relies on control of information flow rather than quality of reporting. Later that evening, as Traoré prepared to return to Ouagadougou, he received a message from Konaté. Verité's latest feature, a collaborative investigation tool that allowed citizens across multiple countries to document environmental impacts of extractive industries, had just gone live. Already, users in 12 African nations were uploading evidence of environmental violations by mining companies that had gone unreported in traditional media. The collective documentation was more comprehensive than what any single news organization could have assembled. This crowdsourced accountability was creating a new kind of transparency in industries that had long operated without sufficient scrutiny. Traoré smiled as he read through the reports. When he had stared at that screen a year ago, reading false quotes attributed to him, he could never have imagined where the response would lead. What had begun as a defensive measure against media misrepresentation had evolved into something far more powerful, a tool for collective truth-telling that transcended borders, languages, and traditional power structures. Ibrahim Traoré stared at the screen in disbelief as he read the news about himself. Under the headline, Africa's Dictator, he was attributed words he had never spoken. His response to this smear campaign had indeed changed the world media order. Not by fighting misinformation with more misinformation, but by creating space for a multiplicity of authentic voices to emerge. In doing so, he had helped reshape not just how Africa communicated with the world, but how Africans communicated with each other. Perhaps his most significant legacy in a continent striving to define its own future.